On the morning of March 8, 2026, oil crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years, and the internet barely noticed because everybody was watching the footage of a merchant tanker burning in the Persian Gulf, abandoned by its crew, drifting toward Iranian territorial waters. But here's what nobody told you. That tanker wasn't the story. The story was what that tanker was carrying and the 33-kilometer-wide bottleneck it was trying to pass through. Because closing that one strip of water, a waterway so narrow you can drive across its shipping lanes in about 2 minutes, doesn't just push oil prices up. It begins to dismantle the global economy, piece by piece, in ways that reach into your grocery store, your gas pump, and the price of next season's harvest. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, and it's happening right now.
Let's start with the geography, because geography is destiny here. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open waters of the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it's about 39 kilometers wide, but the actual navigable shipping channels are 2 lanes, each roughly 3 kilometers across. That's it, 2 3-kilometer-wide corridors of water. For scale, that's narrower than some river crossings you've driven over. Now zoom out. On one side of that narrow gap sits Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. In other words, the countries that collectively sit on the largest concentration of exportable oil on the planet. There is no pipeline system capable of replacing what moves through this strait. The alternatives, pipelines through Saudi Arabia and the UAE, can handle maybe 4 to 5 million barrels a day. The strait normally moves 20 million. For almost 50 years, the global economy has been built on the assumption that this waterway stays open. That assumption just broke. Now let's talk numbers, because the numbers are staggering. Before the crisis began in late February 2026, approximately 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products moved through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on Earth every 24 hours. In terms of seaborne trade specifically, it's closer to 25%, 1 in every 4 barrels shipped by sea. But oil is only part of the story. About 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas also passes through this strait, primarily from Qatar's North Dome field, the largest natural gas reservoir in the world. And then, and this is the part that will haunt you, roughly 1/3 of all seaborne fertilizer trade transits Hormuz. Fertilizers from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE feed crops across Asia, Africa, and South America. When this strait closes, it's not just an energy crisis, it's a food crisis in slow motion. It just takes a growing season to arrive. So how did we get here? The short version, decades of tension, failed negotiations, and one decision made in a war room in late February 2026. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign of airstrikes on Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury. The targets, military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership. Among those killed was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had led the Islamic Republic for over 35 years. Within 24 hours, the situation in the Persian Gulf transformed completely. Iranian naval forces began targeting commercial shipping. By March 1st and 2nd, the first waves of attacks on merchant vessels began, 21 confirmed attacks in total. On March 2nd, a senior IRGC official went on state television and formally declared the strait closed. By March 4th, the Revolutionary Guard claimed full control. The crisis that energy analysts had modeled for decades as a worst-case theoretical scenario had become real, and markets had 48 hours to figure out what that actually meant. What happened to shipping traffic was almost unprecedented in speed. Before the crisis, about 130 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. By early March, that number had collapsed to just 6. 6 ships a day, a 95% drop in under 2 weeks. Iran had not just closed the strait rhetorically, they had mined it. The Revolutionary Guard laid naval mines throughout the shipping lanes, launched drone boat attacks, fired missiles, and used projectile weapons against vessels. One tugboat, the Musafa II, was sunk. At least 16 merchant ships were damaged. 7 were abandoned by their crews. 12 seafarers were killed or went missing. War risk insurance premiums for the Strait, which had been 0.125% of ship value per transit, shot up to between 0.2% and 0.4%. For a very large crude carrier, one of those supertankers you've seen in aerial photos, that's an extra $250,000 per crossing. Overnight, simply attempting to move oil through the Strait became an act of financial and physical courage.
Oil markets responded exactly as you'd expect, except faster. Brent crude, the global benchmark, crossed $100 per barrel on March 8th, the first time in 4 years. But it didn't stop there. By late March, Brent had peaked at $126 per barrel. Dubai crude, the benchmark that most of Asia actually pays, hit a record $166 per barrel. To put that in context, before Operation Epic Fury, oil was trading around $80. In less than a month, it had more than doubled. The Dallas Federal Reserve estimated that removing roughly 20% of global oil supplies in Q2 2026 would raise WTI oil prices to $98 and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in just that one quarter. The International Energy Agency tried to stabilize markets on March 11th by releasing 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves, the single largest emergency release in IEA history. It helped, for about a week. Then the supply math reasserted itself and prices climbed again.
Now here's where it gets personal, and I mean that literally, for roughly 4 billion people in Asia. Before this crisis, 84% of all the crude oil that transited the Strait of Hormuz was headed for Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea alone accounted for 69% of all Hormuz crude oil flows. When the Strait closed, it wasn't Wall Street that had the most to lose. It was a factory worker in Mumbai wondering why her electricity bills just doubled. A farmer in Bangladesh facing LNG prices that had jumped 140% after Iranian attacks on Qatar's facilities. And 99% of Pakistan's LNG imports come from Qatar and the UAE through the Strait. Bangladesh, 72%. India, 53%. For these countries, this isn't an abstract geopolitical story. It's a rolling blackout. It's a manufacturing shutdown. It's a government scrambling to decide which essential service gets power and which one goes dark. The Philippines and Thailand were already reporting energy shortages within weeks of the closure. South Asia, a region of 2 billion people, became the most acute casualty of a conflict it had no part in starting.
But here's the hidden catastrophe, the one that won't fully arrive until planting season: fertilizer. 1/3 of all seaborne fertilizer trade normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are among the world's largest exporters of urea, the nitrogen fertilizer that feeds most of the world's crops. On February 27, 2026, literally the day before the crisis began, urea was trading at $482.50 per ton. By mid-March, it had hit $720 per ton. That's a 50% jump in under 3 weeks. The FAO's chief economist, Maximo Torero, publicly warned that the situation was raising the specter of a global food crisis. His estimate? 30 to 35% of crude oil, 20% of natural gas, and 20 to 30% of global fertilizers were simply no longer moving out of the region. Think about what that means with a 4 to 6 month delay. Farmers who can't afford fertilizer at current prices will plant smaller or skip inputs. That harvest shortfall shows up at grocery stores in late 2026 and 2027. The Strait of Hormuz crisis has a slow-release payload, and the clock is already ticking.
Now, here's the geopolitical twist that almost nobody is covering. Iran didn't close the strait to everyone. It established what you could call a selective passage system, a geopolitical toll booth. Ships from 5 countries were granted safe transit: China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan. Everyone else blocked or charged a toll exceeding $1 million per ship just for the privilege of attempting the crossing. Let that sink in. Iran effectively redrew global trade alliances with a naval decree. The shipping giant Hapag-Lloyd publicly stated it was keeping all vessels out of the strait until there were safety guarantees and clarity on fees. Russia and China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have demanded the strait reopen. The U.S. Navy responded by announcing a formal naval blockade on April 13, 2026. Two sides now physically enforcing contradictory rules on the same body of water. Meanwhile, 15,000 cruise ship passengers were stranded across the region, unable to return home. The Persian Gulf had become the most legally and militarily complex maritime zone in modern history.
So what does all of this add up to? In April 2026, the IMF released its World Economic Outlook, and the numbers were sobering. Global growth, which had been expected to reach 3.4% in 2026, was now projected at just 3.1%. But that's the reference scenario, the one where things don't get much worse. In what the IMF called an adverse scenario, where inflation expectations rise and financial conditions tighten, global growth falls to 2.5% and inflation surges to 5.4%. And in the severe scenario, where oil and gas prices stay 100 to 200.
Here's one more thing nobody's talking about. Helium. Yes, helium. 1/3 of the world's helium supply comes from Qatar's North Dome field, the same field whose LNG shipments have been disrupted. Helium isn't just for birthday balloons. It's the critical cooling agent inside MRI machines, fiber optic cables, and semiconductor fabrication facilities. The microchips in your phone, your car, your laptop, they all require helium in their production. If Qatar's exports stay disrupted long enough, there is a supply chain consequence that ripples into hospitals and electronics manufacturing across the world. This is what a true choke point looks like. It's not one commodity, it's a multiplier. Oil hits your gas pump, LNG hits your electricity bill, fertilizers hit your food prices in 6 months, and helium hits the production lines of the technologies that run modern civilization. The Strait of Hormuz was always the world's most important waterway. In 2026, we are finally being forced to understand why.
As of today, April 17, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. A U.S. naval blockade and Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces are enforcing contradictory rules on the same water. Peace talks have collapsed once. A temporary ceasefire on April 8th lasted days. The IMF is warning of a close call with global recession. Urea is at $720 a ton and rising. And harvest decisions being made this month in fields across Asia and Africa will show up as food prices, higher or lower, in late 2026 and into 2027. Here's the question I'll leave you with. For decades, the world's most powerful economies chose to build their entire energy architecture around a single 3-kilometer-wide shipping lane, controlled by a country we've been in permanent conflict with. We knew this day could come. We planned for it, wargamed it, debated it in policy papers. And when it arrived, we still weren't ready. The real question isn't whether the strait reopens. It's whether, when it does, we'll finally build a world that doesn't depend on it.